I'm Bob Short, and this is Reflections on Georgia Politics, sponsored by the Russell Library at the University of Georgia for Political Research and Studies and the Duckworth Library at Young Harris College. Our guest is John Lewis, a member of the United States Congress and a legendary crusader for social justice. John, we're delighted that you would join us.
Well, Bob, I'm delighted and very pleased to be interviewed by you. It is very good to see you.
Good, thank you. John Robert Lewis from rural Pike County in South Alabama. That's where it all began.
Well, I grew up there. I was born on a farm. My father was a sharecropper, a tenant farmer, about 10 miles outside of Troy. You're right, in rural Pike County. But in 1944, when I was 4 years old, and I do remember when I was 4, my father had saved $300, and with the $300, he bought 110 acres of land. My family still own that land today. On this farm, we raised a lot of cotton and corn, peanuts, hogs, cows, and chickens. On the farm, it was my responsibility to care for the chickens, and I fell in love with raising chickens like no one else could raise chickens. You know, Bob, I could tell you the story about the chicken, but it'd probably be so boring. I became very good at it, and those chickens taught me a great deal. They taught me patience. They taught me to take the long, hard look and never give up or give in or give out, and just wait for 3 weeks after setting its setting hen. There would be some more little chicks. When we would visit the little town of Troy, visit Tuskegee, visit Union Spring, Montgomery, Birmingham, I saw those signs that said white men, colored men, white women, colored women, white waiting, colored waiting. And I would come home and ask my mother, my father, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, why? They would say, that's the way it is. Don't get in the way, don't get in trouble. But in 1955, at the age of 15, I was in the 10th grade. I heard about Rosa Parks. I heard the words of Martin Luther King Jr. on the old radio. And the action of Rosa Parks, the words and leadership of Dr. King inspired me to find a way to get in the way, to get in trouble, what I call good trouble, necessary trouble. So for many years, I've been getting in trouble.
Mm-hmm. You went to the segregated school in Troy.
I attended segregated schools. I was bused long distance over unpaid roads past white schools in order to get to a segregated, overcrowded school. But I remember the Supreme Court decision of 1954. I was 14 years old in the 9th grade, and I thought maybe, just maybe the next year, I would be attending a beautiful school, riding a nice school bus, but it never happened for me.
So you finished high school in Troy and then went off to college.
I finished high school and went off to a little school in Nashville, Tennessee, called American Baptist College. It was a seminary studying for the ministry, but I wanted to attend Troy State. I submitted an application, high school transcript. Troy State was only 10 miles from my home. It's known as Troy University today. I never heard a word from the school. So I wrote a letter to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and told him I needed his help. He wrote me back, sent me a round-trip Greyhound bus ticket, and invited me to come to Montgomery to meet with him. So he heard later that I was in Nashville and suggested when I was home for spring break to come and see him. So on a Saturday morning, in March of 1958, by this time I'm 18 years old, my father drove me to the Greyhound bus station. I boarded a bus. I traveled the 50 miles from Troy to Montgomery. And a young lawyer by the name of Fred Gray met me at the Greyhound bus station. Fred Gray had been a lawyer for Dr. King, for Rosa Parks, and later became our lawyer during the sit-ins and during the Freedom Ride, met me and drove me to the First Baptist Church in downtown Montgomery. And I saw Reverend Abernathy and Dr. King standing behind a desk. I was so scared. I was so frightened. I didn't know what to say. And Dr. King spoke up and said, "Are you the boy from Troy? Are you John Lewis?" And I said, "Dr. King, I am John Robert Lewis." I gave my whole name. And that was the beginning of my relationship with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
Let's talk about your activities in Nashville. You joined a group of students there and were primarily responsible for the sit-ins in Nashville.
In Nashville, a group of students from Tennessee State, Fisk University, American Baptist Theological Seminary, Mahara Medical College, Vanderbilt University, Peabody College, that's another little school, Scarrett College, a Methodist school. There was a black and white college student and some high school student. Every Tuesday night at 6:30 p.m., we would meet at a little Methodist church and we would study the way of peace, the way of love, the way of nonviolence. We studied what Gandhi attempted to do in South Africa, what he accomplished in India. We studied what Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was all about in Montgomery. We studied Thoreau and civil disobedience. So before we went on a sit-in, we were prepared. We studied the great religions of the world. And then we had what we call, Bob, role playing, social drama, blacks and white students playing the roles of whites, the roles of blacks. And then we started sitting in. We started sitting in the fall of 1959. Before the sit-in actually started in Greensboro, North Carolina on February the 1st, 1960. Mm-hmm. But after they started there, we started sitting in on a regular basis in downtown Nashville.
So you had developed Dr. King's nonviolence policy even before you started your sit-in movement.
We had adopted Dr. King's philosophy of nonviolence and passive resistance before we started sitting in. And many of us grew to accept the philosophy and discipline of nonviolence, not simply as a technique, as a tactic, but as a way of life, as a way of living.
Mm-hmm. James Lawson.
James Lawson, this wonderful man, this unbelievable human being. He was like a saint. He was, in a sense, a mystic. He was this man who really believed. He was a Methodist minister. He had been opposed to the Korean War. He was a pacifist, but he literally imbues us. He sort of pumped the way of peace, the way of love, the way of nonviolence into our very essence, into our very being, into our guts. And after you came out of the classes and discussion with Jim Lawson, you were ready. You were ready to sit in. You were ready to go on a freedom ride. You were ready to die for what you believed in.
He was your mentor.
Jim Lawson was my mentor. Mm-hmm. He was a person who gave me the ability and the capacity not to be afraid, to stand up, how to say no. Growing up in rural Alabama, working with those chickens and working on that farm, I grew up a little shy, but the teaching of Jim Lawson, it all came out. You know, you'd be sitting there on a lunch kind of stools, and some reporter will walk up and say, "Are you a leader? Why are you sitting here?" And you had to respond. And I would say, "I'm just a participant. I'm just trying to do some good. I'm just trying to help out." But Jim Lawson taught us how to speak up and speak out, mm-hmm. and not be afraid.
John, before we get further, you once told me that your ambition was to be a minister.
As a young child growing up, I wanted to be a minister. And I tried out some of my first sermons preaching to the chickens. And I would talk to these chickens. And I remember gathering all of our chickens as a young child in the chicken yard. And my brothers and sisters and my first cousin would line the outside of the chicken yard. But they helped make up the audience, the congregation. And I would start speaking or preaching. And when I look back on it, some of those chickens would bow their heads. Some of those chickens would shake their heads. They never quite said amen. But I am convinced that some of those chickens that I preached to in the 40s and the 50s tended to listen to me much better than some of my colleagues listen to me today in the Congress. And some of those chickens were just a little more productive. At least they produce eggs.
Okay, back to Nashville. Diane Nash, C.T. Vivian.
Diane Nash, young, beautiful woman. C.T. Vivian, minister, religious leaders. These two people were so committed, so dedicated. Diane Nash emerged as a symbol of the movement. She was a student leader. She held us together. We made up a coalition. We called the Nashville movement the Nashville Student Nonviolent Movement. C.T. was a little older. He was sort of part of the adult group, but he was there with us every step of the way, sitting in, helping to organize the withdrawal campaign for downtown Nashville, and later going on the Freedom Ride with us.
What did you think sitting there at an all-white lunch counter?
When we were sitting there, I know I can recall the first day just sitting there, we would dress up. We would put, like we would go into church, we put on our best. And you're sitting there in an orderly, peaceful, nonviolent fashion, waiting to be served. You were sort of anchored to those lunch counter stools. And someone would come up and say, why are you sitting here? Or maybe someone would spit on us, or pour hot water, hot coffee, hot chocolate on us. Or maybe put out a lighted cigarette in our hair, or down our backs, pull us up to lunch counter stool. We didn't retaliate. We believed in the philosophy of nonviolence. And then someone would start beating us or hitting us. We would get arrested and go to jail. I remember, Bob, the first time I got arrested, it was February 27, 1960. And that day, when I was arrested, placed in the wagon with other young people to be transported to the Nashville City Jail, I felt so free. I felt so liberated. I felt like I crossed over.
Were you prepared to be arrested?
I was prepared. I was prepared to be arrested. I was prepared to go to jail. We thought it was a possibility that we would be arrested, that we would go to jail. But we knew in our own hearts that we hadn't violated any laws. We were charged with disorderly conduct. We were very orderly. We were peaceful. It was the trump-up charge that the city brought against us to disrupt the sit-ins.
Let's talk for a minute about the movement. Early on, Justice Marshall thought the best way to achieve success was in the courts. Dr. King seemed to think the way to achieve success was through political means and legislation. But you young people realized that to get the movement really going, that you had to do something, so you hit the streets. Is that a good assessment?
That is a very good assessment. We felt that we had to expand what Dr. King had started and create a mass movement and organize students and young people and people not so young all across the South, but all across America. I remember a conversation that I had with Thurgood Marshall after the Freedom Ride on Fisk University campus in Nashville. After we had been released from jail, many of us came back to Nashville. And Thurgood Marshall took the position, and he said to me in so many words, John, it doesn't make any damn sense for you all to continue to go on those freedom rides and continue to sit in and get beaten, your head busted open. We can take one case and take it to the United States Supreme Court. And I tried to say, Mr. Marshall, we want to create a mass movement to involve more than lawyers, but involve the masses. Dr. King thought that we could go into one city and use that city maybe as a model, like he did in Albany or Birmingham or Montgomery.
Mm-hmm. the most effective, I think you'll agree, John, the most effective methods of protest at the time were the sit-in, the freedom rides, the Mississippi Summer, the March on Washington. But let's talk about those for a minute. Let's start with the freedom rides. Now, you're on the freedom rides.
In 1961, 13 of us was part of the original freedom ride. It was based on a Supreme Court decision in 1960, banning racial discrimination in public transportation and in intrastate travel. But in most of the South, the 11 southern states of the old Confederacy, from Virginia to Texas, there's separate waiting rooms, separate restroom facility. You couldn't use the same lunch counter, a restaurant. And we decided to test that decision. Before we started the Freedom Ride, a group of 13 met in Washington, D.C. from May 1st through May 3rd, going through a period of training and orientation. And I remember so well the night of May 3rd, we all went downtown Washington to a Chinese restaurant. Now, growing up in rural Alabama, attending school in Nashville, Tennessee, I've never been to a Chinese restaurant before, never had Chinese food. And someone said that night, you should eat well, because this may be like the Last Supper. It was a wonderful meal, a delicious meal. And after the meal, we went to our different rooms and got up the next morning, had breakfast. We all got ready to board a Greyhound bus and others to board a trailway bus to travel from Washington, D.C. And when we left Washington on the bus, black and white people were seated together. But when you got to Virginia, we were supposed to separate. And we went through Virginia without any serious problems. We arrived in Charlotte, North Carolina, and one young black man attempted to test a white waiting room and try to get a shoe shine in a so-called white barbershop in the so-called white waiting room. He was arrested and taken to jail for trying to get a shoe shine. The next day, my seatmate, a young white gentleman, we had been seated together on a Greyhound bus. We arrived in Rock Hill, South Carolina, and tried to enter the so-called white waiting room. We were attacked, beaten, and left lying in a pool of blood. The local police officials came up and wanted to know whether we wanted to press charges. We said no. We come with peace and love and nonviolence. 48 years later, after that incident, one of the people who beat me came to my office in Washington and said, Mr. Lewis, I'm one of the people that attacked you on May 9, 1961. I want to apologize. He came with his son. His son had been encouraging his father to do this. I told him I accept his apology. He started crying. His son started crying. He hugged me. I hugged him back. And since then, I've seen this gentleman 4 different times. We traveled together to different parts of the country. He called me brother, and I called him brother.
Great story.
That was the power of the Freedom Ride. That was the power of the Civil Rights Movement.
During the Freedom Rides, you had no trouble in Georgia, did you?
We didn't have any trouble here in the state of Georgia. Came through Georgia and met with Dr. King here. Between here and Birmingham, outside of the city of Anniston, Alabama, the bus was attacked and burned. And those riding on the trailway bus was beaten at the Greyhound bus station in Birmingham.
You were in Anniston, and you were attacked and beaten, but that didn't stop the Freedom Rides.
The freedom rides couldn't stop. We couldn't give up. We couldn't give in. Even after Bull Connor stopped some of us in Birmingham, took us into protective custody, and took us to the Tennessee-Alabama state line, and we went back by car. And the other students came from Nashville and picked up the ride, and we continued. Even after we was beaten and left bloody in Montgomery at the Greyhound bus station, we continued. Even after we were arrested in Jackson, Mississippi, late May of 1961, the same year that President Barack Obama was born. Field City Jail, the county jail in Jackson, and later we were transported to Parchman State Penitentiary. But we stayed in jail, most of us, for more than 40 days. Parchman is not a good place for anybody. Black, white, it's just not a good place. You know, people write about Parchman in plays, novels. No one should ever want to go there. But we stayed there. But the Freedom Ride led to the desegregation of public transportation all across the South in a very, very short time. Because of the Freedom Ride, President Kennedy and his brother Robert Kennedy called upon the Interstate Commerce Commission to issue an order banning segregation and racial discrimination in public transportation. So those signs that said white waiting, colored waiting, came tumbling down in bus station and train station all across America.
You were a co-founder and president at one time of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. If I may, can I call it SNCC? That's what everyone calls it.
It was better known as SNCC. We all call it SNCC.
Yeah, you were a founder and very active in that organization. Tell us a little bit about the formation of the organization and its goals.
Well, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was conceived, if I could call it conception, in the mind of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and a young woman named Ella Baker who was working for Dr. King. It was all of these students, protests all around the South. And Dr. King asked this woman to hold a meeting someplace in the South. So she selected Shaw University in North Carolina, the school that she had graduated from, Easter weekend of April 1960. And more than 300 young people met. James Lawson was the keynote speaker. Dr. King attended the meeting. Julian Bond, Diane Nash, Marion Barry. And at that meeting, there was a great debate between the students from Atlanta and the students from Nashville over who would become the chair and where the office would be located. And Marion Barry, who later became the mayor of Washington, D.C., was elected the national chair of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And he was the temporary chair of the temporary Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And later, the group met in Atlanta on Morehouse College campus in October 1960 and became a permanent organization. Julian Bond played a major role. Julian was key. He was the communication director for the organization. He was a student at Morehouse College and became one of the people that we depended on to get the information out about what SNCC was all about. Mm-hmm. Marion served for about 2 years, and then another young man by the name of Chuck McDew, who was a student at South Carolina State University, became the second chair. And then in May of 1966, I was elected chair. May of 1963, I should say, I was elected chair, became the third chair of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and served longer than any other person as the national chairman of SNCC.
I'm sure you're happy with the results of SNCC.
Well, I'm very pleased that the organization made a major contribution to the whole cause of civil rights. I didn't like the way the organization ended. I know many years later, Stokely Carmichael became the chair. And during that period, it laid down a commitment to the philosophy and to the discipline of nonviolence. And SNCC died what I call a natural death.
Mm-hmm. John, I'm sure you've heard this 1,000 times, but President Jimmy Carter once said that if you want to scare South Georgia farmers, you don't say Martin Luther King, you say SNCC. Did you realize that you were that powerful?
During that period, I never considered ourselves so powerful. We refer to ourselves as a circle of trust, as a band of brothers and sisters. We were black and white young people trying to make America better. And I think we did a pretty good job in changing America forever. And there's students and young people and people not so young all over the world that have been inspired by the contribution, not only of SNCC, but of Dr. King and the other organizations and individuals. Because you can travel almost any part of America today, any part of the world today, and people can sing, "We Shall Overcome."
Lyndon Johnson sang that.
Lyndon Johnson, in I think, one of the greatest speeches that any American president ever made.
When we get, excuse me, go ahead.
On the cause of civil rights, of voting rights, was a speech that Lyndon Johnson made on March 15th, 1965. We call it the "We Shall Overcome" speech.
It was a great speech. Jack Nelson once said that in the South, you remember Jack? He was
I remember Jack Nelson. He was a wonderful, wonderful, brave and courageous reporter. If it had been for people like Jack, some of us wouldn't have survived. Because Jack was there. He told the story.
Mm-hmm. He said that votes, not hearts, will change the racial climate in the South. You've always believed that.
Well, I believe in the power of the vote. I think the vote is the most powerful, nonviolent tool or instrument that we have in a democratic society. And the vote has been a very powerful instrument for making the South and making our country a better place.
You once headed up the voter education project.
For several years, almost 7 years, I headed the voter education project known as VEP. We worked all across the South. It was a wonderful days. It was days of hope and optimism, going into these small towns and rural communities in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, North, South Carolina, Louisiana. I remember one day being in a little place called Waterproof, Louisiana, in a hall called Good Samaritan Hall, and just telling people that they need to get registered, not be afraid, and get registered and vote. They didn't have any African American elected officials there. Several years later, I went back there, and they had a biracial city council. People living and working together. And you go to places today like Selma, Alabama, Lowndes County, Alabama, where in 1965, they didn't have a single registered African American voter. And today it's a biracial city government, county government.
How many times were you arrested?
During the 60s, I was arrested 40 times. Many in Nashville, but a few times in Atlanta, in Mississippi, Alabama, Selma, over and over again in Selma.
So you're standing on the Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, attempting to march to Montgomery on a mission for voter rights. What was it like?
It was a simple effort to march from Selma to Montgomery, to dramatize to the state of Alabama and to the nation that people wanted to register to vote. We were standing there. I was wearing a trench coat, backpack. I walked beside a young man by the name of Hosea Williams. The two of us were leading the march. We get to the highest point on the bridge, and down below Bob, we saw a sea of blue, Alabama state troopers. And behind the state trooper, you saw Sheriff Clark posse. Sheriff Clark had requested that all white men over the age of 21 to come down to the courthouse to be deputized, to become part of his posse, to stop the march the night before. We get within hearing distance of the state troopers. Man identified himself and said, "I'm Major John Cloud of the Alabama State Troopers. This is an unlawful march, will not be allowed to continue. I give you 3 minutes to disperse and return to your church." And Hosea Williams spoke up and said, "Major, give us a moment to kneel and pray." And the major said, "Troopers, advance." You saw these men putting on their gas masks. They came toward us, beating us with nightsticks, trampling us with horses, releasing the tear gas. I was hit in the head by a state trooper with a nightstick. I had a concussion at the bridge. My feet, my legs just became weak, went from under me, and I fell. I thought I saw death. I thought I was going to die. And all these many years later, I don't recall how I made it back across that bridge, crossing the Alabama River, back to that little church, Brown Chapel AME Church. But I do recall being back at the church, and someone asked me to say something to the audience. And I stood up and said, "I don't understand it. I don't understand it. How President Johnson can send troops to Vietnam and cannot send troops to Selma, Alabama to protect people who only desires to register to vote." And the next thing I knew, I had been admitted to the Good Samaritan Hospital there in Selma with 16 other people. It was a group of nuns that ran the hospital. They took care of us. These beautiful, wonderful sisters. If it hadn't been for them, I don't know what would have happened to many of us that day.
But you regrouped.
We did, Bob, we did regroup. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. came to Selma that following Monday morning to visit us. And I remember him coming to my bedside and said, "John, don't worry. We'll make it from Selma to Montgomery, and the Voting Rights Act will be passed." And he told me that he had made an appeal for religious leaders to come to Selma. So on Tuesday, March 9th, more than 1,000 ministers, priests, rabbis, and nuns came from all across America to Selma. They walked to that same point where we had been beaten 2 days earlier. They had a prayer, a song, and they turned back. And we went into federal court and got an order with a federal judge named Frank M. Johnson from North Alabama. Unbelievable man, prince of a man. Gave us everything that we had requested and said that we had a constitutional right to march from Selma to Montgomery in an orderly fashion. And President Johnson called Governor Wallace to Washington to try to get assurance from him that he would be able to protect us. The governor could not assure the president. President Johnson made a decision to call out part of the military to protect us on that 50 miles walk from Montgomery, from Selma to Montgomery. And we walked the 50 miles during a period of 5 days. And President Johnson made that speech on March 15th, 1965. I could hear him speaking out. He said, I speak tonight for the dignity of man and for the destiny of democracy. At time, history and fate meet in a single place, and man search for freedom. He said, so it was more than a century ago at Lexington, at Concord. So it was at Appomattox. So it was last week in Selma, Alabama. He condemned the violence in Selma. He introduced the Voting Rights Act. And before he concluded that speech, he said, and we shall overcome. We shall overcome. I looked at Dr. King and was sitting next to him. He was crying. Tears came down his face. And we all cried a little. And because of what Lyndon Johnson did, the Congress gave him a standing ovation. The Voting Rights Act was passed, debated and passed, and was signed into law on August 6, 1965. And because of that act, there has been a transformation of Southern politics and national politics. And we're a better country. We're better people.
Looking back over those years of nonviolent protest, is there anything you might have done differently?
The only thing that I think that I probably would have done different was to spend more time listening to, maybe speaking with, and maybe trying to learn more from Dr. King and from others.
What do you consider to be your greatest accomplishment?
My greatest accomplishment is, more than anything else, I allowed myself to be used for good. Allowed myself to get in trouble, good trouble, necessary trouble. And for more than 50 years, I've been getting in trouble.
Your biggest disappointment?
My biggest disappointment that maybe we just didn't do the best possible job of teaching more people the way of peace, the way of love, the way of nonviolence. I think we still have a great distance to go, and we have a great deal of work to do. We need to spend more time educating and sensitizing our young people. And it doesn't matter whether they're black or white, Latino, Asian American, or Native American. There's a growing interest on the part of young people in this period in our history. And they want to know, but we should have spent more time many years ago when it would have been fresh in their minds and memory.
Finally, John Robert Lewis, how would you like to be remembered?
Bob, I would like to remember as some guy who grew up in rural Alabama and was somehow touched by what I like to call the spirit of history, and allowed the spirit of history to use me and to guide me to try to do some good, to try to leave this little piece of real estate a little greener, a little cleaner, and a little more peaceful.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob.
It's good to see you.
It's very good to see you, my friend, my brother.
Thank you.